Rate policy versus mint burn. So basically here what they're showing is why was a rate policy chosen instead of a mint burn policy, which is essentially how most tokenized real world assets and also things like USDT and other things like that work. So we intentionally built tokenized Tesla as a policy peg instead of mint burn. This aligns with our core mandate of acquiring more Leo and using that collateral for product backing. So here it lists some features and then the kind of differences between a policy peg versus a mint burn peg. So short-term peg stability, a policy peg has a medium, essentially a medium effect on short-term peg stability, while a mint burn peg has a high effect. So if you have a mint burn peg, you actually need to manage that peg. If you have a policy peg, you let the interest rate manage the peg. The mint burn peg is a little bit more fragile, which is the next point. And the policy peg is a lot less fragile, and there's no run on the bank dynamics because you can't redeem TTSLA into TSLA. So it's all driven by yield dynamics. The volatility management, like I said, yield plus fees versus mint and burn arbitrage. The response speed of the peg is controlled and slower when it's a policy, and it's fast and automatic when it's mint burn. The capital efficiency is much higher with a policy peg because it just simply uses one type of collateral. And that collateral is Leo on Leo Strategy's balance sheet. So it's something that's very easy to understand, very capital efficient versus a mint burn peg, which is a lot lower because you need to actually have one-to-one reserves. So for example, if you have USDT, you need to have 1,000 USD in, whatever treasury bills if you want. That's what USDT does a lot of. And then you need 1,000 of that if you have 1,000 USDT out there in the world versus the capital efficiency of Leo Strategy's model is much higher because you just have Leo sitting in a vault. And as that Leo grows over time, it allows you to scale up the market. The attack surface is much lower with a policy peg versus a mint burn peg. You can also have run on the bank. So if there's any concern over liquidity or any concern in the marketplace of any kind, and you've seen this happen with banks, you've seen this happen with Terra Luna, for example, the mint burn style of pegs is much more exploitable and has a much higher attack surface. This policy peg has a very low attack surface. So if you want to attack the peg of TTSLA, all you're going to do is basically buy up a bunch of TTSLA and then try to crash the price. But by crashing the price, there's no run on the bank because nobody can redeem. What happens is Leo Strategy just increases the interest rate or the yield of TTSLA in order to drive more demand and drive TTSLA back towards its peg. So the attack surface of a policy peg is significantly less because all you're going to do is drive the yield higher, which is then going to bring in more buyers, and your effect is not going to be very, it's not going to be, first of all, it's not going to be profitable for whoever does it. And then it's also just going to be driven back up by yield policy as opposed to a run on the bank, which is impossible. Education complexity, higher. So the policy peg is a lot higher to educate people on versus mint burn, because with mint burn, you basically know, okay, there's 1,000 USDT, so there should be 1,000 USD backing it, and you can just kind of switch back and forth between the two. With a policy peg, you need to explain that the price of TTSLA's correlation to TSLA is governed by yield. So if the price goes low for TTSLA, the yield goes up. If the price goes high, the yield goes down, and you have to essentially, the gap of explaining that to people versus just saying, hey, you can just redeem this is a lot higher. And that's why we're doing this video. The tail risk behavior. So tail risk is essentially like long-term risk. The main risk for a policy peg is gradual deviation away from the peg, which means that Leo Strategy would owe a much higher yield on TTSLA than the baseline 3%. With a mint burn peg, you have a lot more attack surface, like we talked about earlier, because of the reflexive collapse. If people start to run on the bank, they start to redeem too much, things like USDT, and you saw it with things like Terra Luna where there wasn't enough collateral to back the issuance, those things can just collapse. And this happens to banks all the time. Silicon Valley Bank is a good recent example. If you have too much of a run on the bank goes out of business, especially because they're doing fractional reserve banking. That type of risk is not possible with TTSLA because it uses yield policy. So if there's a run on TTSLA, what that means is everyone's just selling their TTSLA to the market, which drops the price. Well, Leo Strategy doesn't have to handle redemptions. All they do is increase the yield until someone comes in and buys it. So essentially it allows, it's super market maximalism, if you want to say, where Leo Strategy is letting the market decide the price And if the price goes below where the peg is, then Leo Strategy just injects more yield into TTSLA, which then drives more demand.